You grew up believing in magical kisses, friendly animals, and flawless happy endings. Well, history is here to violently ruin your childhood. Behind every sweet bedtime story is a bizarre, deeply unsettling, and completely unhinged reality that society desperately tried to hide. From psychotic royal drama to massive industrial nightmares, we are exposing 32 weirdest, dumbest, and highly horrifying real events that inspired famous fairy tales. Your precious memories are done for. 1. Aladdin is undeniably the most geographically confused cultural mashup in literary history. The famous magical version you know did not even exist in the earliest Arabic manuscripts. It was actually brought to Paris by a brilliant Syrian storyteller named Hannah Diab, who basically did all the heavy lifting while French translators happily stole the spotlight. To make things infinitely more ridiculous, the text explicitly claims the story happens in China. Yet absolutely everything from the sultans and Islamic architecture to the political structure aggressively screams Middle East. It is basically global folklore doing terrible, improvised theater with zero geography skills and unearned confidence. The real magic trick is not a wish-granting genie. The illusion is how a Syrian told, French translated, fake Chinese tale became the default Western fantasy without a single reader checking a map. 2. Snow White hides a historical origin so incredibly dark, it makes the evil queen look like a reasonable stepmother. Historians point to Margaretha von Waldeck, a 16th-century German noblewoman who tragically died young under massive rumors of foul poisoning. But the truly messed up part is the Seven Dwarfs. Her immensely wealthy family owned massive copper mines, and those cute little whistling miners were actually inspired by horribly abused child laborers. These poor kids suffered horrific physical deformities and severely stunted growth from brutal working conditions and toxic chemical exposure. Suddenly, that cheerful woodland cottage looks less like a magical getaway and more like an industrial tragedy with a singing bird soundtrack attached. Nothing screams sweet bedtime story quite like aristocratic murder and the crushing weight of early capitalism destroying children before puberty. 3. Gulliver's Travels turns incredibly sinister when you realize the disgusting yahoos were not just random fantasy monsters created for cheap laughs. They were a razor-sharp savage satire of how English colonial powers viewed the Irish population. Jonathan Swift forced his readers to look at how arrogant ruling classes describe subjected people, constantly painting them as dirty, irrational, and basically animalistic. Why? Because once you convince yourself that a specific group of people is barely human, aggressively exploiting them just sounds like standard government administration. Connecting the yahoos to the ugly habit of empire building reveals a horrifying truth about global politics. Satire is brilliant, but it is deeply unsettling when it proves that civilized society only needs a tiny excuse to start acting like completely unhinged barbarians with fancy vocabularies. 4. Cinderella was rocking a massive glamorous transformation long before the European glass slipper was ever invented. The oldest known version actually traces straight back to ancient Egypt and a Greek slave named Rhodopis. In this bizarre historical account, a giant eagle snatches her sandal while she is bathing and drops it directly into the lap of the Egyptian king, who instantly decides he must marry the owner. The highly disturbing layer here is that her magical fantasy starts from actual literal enslavement, not just dealing with mildly annoying stepsisters. Her rescue only feels miraculous because she had zero human rights in a system built on treating people like disposable property. It is wild that the ultimate romantic destiny story relies on a giant wild bird being infinitely more helpful than the entire legal system surrounding her. 5. The Little Engine. That could sound like pure wholesome inspiration, until you realize it is basically highly effective propaganda for early 20th century industrial exhaustion. On the surface, it is a cute little story about a tiny train repeating a positive motivational phrase to get up a massive hill. But looking closer at a society obsessed with relentless productivity and zero rest, the hidden message gets super creepy. The little engine succeeds by completely ignoring intense physical strain and pushing past total physical failure, which is exactly the toxic mindset industrial bosses demanded from their severely overworked factory workers. Saying "I think I can" is adorable, right up to the exact point where it becomes the official corporate slogan for a culture politely demanding you violently burn yourself out for minimum wage while smiling. 6. Alibaba and the 40 Thieves is wildly famous for magic passwords and secret caves, but everybody ignores the psychotic mass slaughter involving boiling oil. Morgiana finds the thieves hiding in giant clay jars and casually murders every single one of them by pouring scalding hot oil directly over their heads. This only sounds shocking to modern ears if you forget that ancient warfare was comfortable with fire and incredibly creative ways to end human life. There is no honorable sword fight, no heroic final dialogue, and no epic battle music. It is just dozens of adult men being slow-cooked in household pottery because old-school folklore was deeply unbothered by extreme violence. Magic passwords might open the secret cave, but industrial-grade revenge is the actual highlight of a world where massive cruelty was considered a practical household skill. 7. Mother Goose feels like a completely harmless childhood staple, until you look closely at her outfit and realize she is wearing the exact uniform of a violently persecuted European witch. The pointy hat, the weird animal companion, the sharp profile, and the creepy old lady vibe were the exact traits deeply paranoid societies used to brutally torture and execute tens of thousands of innocent women. It is genuinely weird that a beloved children's storyteller inherited all her visual baggage directly from an era of mass religious paranoia and literal burnings at the stake. History has this bizarre habit of taking its ugliest panics, painting them in nice pastel colors, and putting them right next to a baby crib. We basically took the ultimate symbol of historical terror, slapped a cute smile on her face, and handed her a full-time job in childcare. 8. The Pied Piper of Hamelin is absolutely not a clever myth about keeping promises. It is a desperate historical cover-up for a very real and massive town trauma. The official church records of Hamelin clearly state that in the year 1284, 130 children left the town and never came back. The entire rat infestation subplot was made up and added centuries later to spice up the basic plot. The original horror was purely about mass disappearance, whether through extreme disease, bizarre military recruitment, or some other devastating local disaster. Folklore had to step in because raw, unexplained mass grief was simply too heavy for the town to process. When a community literally invents a magic flute player to explain why an entire generation of kids vanished overnight, you know the true historical facts were devastating. 9. Alice in Wonderland loses its quirky, whimsical charm the exact second you learn that being as mad as a hatter was a literal medical nightmare, not a fun personality trait. Victorian hatmakers heavily treated felt with highly toxic mercury compounds in boiling hot, unventilated rooms. Long-term exposure caused violent physical tremors, extreme mood swings, slurred speech, and complete neurological collapse by the time these poor workers hit middle age. So the Mad Hatter is not just a wacky guy who loves a good tea party, he is a walking victim of severe industrial poisoning. Society basically decided that looking incredibly stylish in a fancy top hat was completely worth melting a poor factory worker's actual brain. Wonderland feels surreal, mostly because the real world supplying it was fine with sacrificing human nervous systems for high-end fashion accessories. 10. Pocahontas becomes a tragedy of epic proportions when you use her real name, Matoaka, and look at unfiltered colonial history. She was violently captured by the English in 1613, held hostage, forced into a total religious conversion, and married off to John Rolfe purely for massive political leverage. There was absolutely no magical forest romance or talking raccoons happening here. The English then shipped her off to London as a living billboard for the Virginia Company to prove their violent colonial invasion was a friendly, highly profitable success. She tragically died there at just 20 years old. The real scandal is not that a cartoon studio simplified her life, it is that the actual events were a brutal kidnapping and a cynical public relations stunt violently disguised as a happy ending. Global empire building loves a good rebrand. 11. Mulan gets way more depressing the further you look into Chinese literary history and shifting cultural politics. In the original ancient ballad, she fights bravely, wins massive honor, goes home, and simply reveals she is a woman with zero negative consequences or highly dramatic executions. But as later centuries became vastly more obsessed with strict oppressive gender rules, the entire story severely mutated. Newer versions punished her heavily, sometimes even forcing her into a highly tragic suicide. Society loved the fantastic idea of a badass female warrior, right up until they realized her existence might seriously disrupt the fragile patriarchy. Even when a woman proved massive courage and absolute military loyalty, the culture always kept one hand hovering directly over the ultimate punishment button. It is a harsh reminder that history found female heroism incredibly useful, but also deeply terrifying. 12. Beauty and the Beast is a tragic reality violently disguised as high romance once you meet the real historical figure, Petrus Gonsalves. He was a 16th century man with a super rare genetic condition causing extremely thick hair all over his face and body. Wealthy European aristocrats educated him, dressed him in highly expensive silk, and married him off, all while treating him exactly like an exotic pet in a high society human zoo. They even commissioned fancy royal paintings of his similarly afflicted children just to openly stare at them. Beneath the totally sweet fairy tale message about loving someone for their inner beauty is a horrifying history of elites treating actual humans like weird carnival attractions. The royal courts were basically just incredibly wealthy freak shows, where having a fancy title made absolute dehumanization look like sophisticated culture. 13. The Hunchback of Notre Dame becomes a hauntingly true story because actual researchers found written proof of a hunchbacked stone carver working at the cathedral during Victor Hugo's lifetime. This means Quasimodo was highly likely not just a crazy product of extreme Gothic imagination, but a real, highly visible laborer hauling extremely heavy stone in 19th century Paris. It adds a completely crushing layer of profound sadness to the entire novel. Behind all the highly dramatic bell ringing and extremely tragic romance, there was probably a real guy whose physical body was permanently destroyed by brutal manual labor and total social rejection. Victor Hugo completely stole his silhouette and made this anonymous worker immortal in global literature. Meanwhile, real society probably just walked right past him every single day without ever bothering to learn his actual name. 14. Hansel and Gretel transforms into pure historical trauma when you violently crash it into the Great Famine of 1315. Europe suffered such relentless heavy rain and catastrophic crop failure that mass starvation completely destroyed basic human morality in a record time. Historical records show absolute nightmares unfolding. Desperate parents totally abandoning their kids in the deep woods because there was simply no food left, and in some horrific cases, violently resorting to actual cannibalism. The Evil Witch and the highly unrealistic Candy House are just colorful distractions from the brutal math of extreme terrifying hunger. When people are literally starving to absolute death, even a huge house made of baked sweets sounds like a totally logical hallucination. The story only exists because extreme famine violently turns your own loving family into dangerous strangers. 15. The shoemaker and the elves seems completely adorable right up until you realize it is the ultimate fantasy for highly greedy factory owners. The guy simply goes to sleep and magically wakes up incredibly rich because tiny invisible workers did all the heavy lifting for zero pay. When the massive industrial revolution violently kicked into high gear, this cute tale heavily mirrored the incredibly dark reality of brutal child labor and highly abusive sweatshops. Those magical little elves look a whole lot like extremely exhausted, totally underpaid factory workers whose basic humanity was completely ignored by the rich upper class. Magic is honestly just a fantastic polite cover-up for massive wage theft and severe labor exploitation. The shoemaker gets a massive financial miracle, while real history simply gave the actual workers broken backs, ruined lungs, and relentlessly demanding bosses. 16. Baba Yaga flying around in a highly weird hut on giant chicken legs sounds like the result of serious medieval hallucinogens, but it actually started as totally practical local architecture. Old Slavic builders heavily relied on constructing food storage huts on raised wooden stumps or tall stilts to completely keep hungry rats and severe dampness out of their highly crucial winter supplies. Somehow, highly dramatic storytellers looked at a totally normal storage shed and violently decided it was simply not quite terrifying enough for local children. So they intensely imagined the wooden stilts were giant creepy bird legs, threw a terrifying child-eating witch inside, and turned a basic pantry into premium top-tier nightmare fuel. It perfectly explains how human beings can look at a brilliant rural engineering solution and immediately ask how it could brutally curse their entire bloodline. 17. Jack and the Beanstalk is a total historical scam that somehow managed to perfectly rebrand highly aggressive home invasion as glorious heroic destiny. In the oldest versions, Jack aggressively climbs up, entirely breaks into a total stranger's house, heavily steals all their gold, and then brutally murders the homeowner when he finally gets caught. That is absolutely not a brave underdog hero. That is just a highly motivated serial burglar with incredibly good luck and zero morals. Later, nervous publishers realized Jack was basically a complete psychopath, so they instantly invented a fake backstory falsely claiming the giant actually stole from Jack's dad first. Without that fake legal justification, Jack is just a completely cheerful bandit who successfully turned grand larceny and homicide into a massive personal win. He basically gaslit an entire generation. 18. The Princess and the Frog absolutely did not originally end with a highly magical, super romantic kiss in the beautiful moonlight. The actual original Grimm Brothers version is an absolute masterclass in extreme, totally unhinged physical violence. The highly spoiled princess gets so unbelievably grossed out by the talking frog that she aggressively picks him up and violently hurls him against a solid brick wall. And that massive brain trauma is exactly what completely breaks the curse. It entirely turns a super sweet bedtime story into a wildly unhinged lesson in highly aggressive magical assault. But it makes total sense for a brutal medieval era that genuinely believed you could perfectly cure sickness or demonic curses by literally beating the illness completely out of a human body. The original cure for a magical transformation was just severe, targeted, blunt force trauma. 19. The Little Mermaid is absolutely not just deeply sad because she totally loses the handsome prince to another random woman. It is actually a massive, completely horrifying story about totally terrifying existential dread. In Hans Christian Andersen's original version, mermaids absolutely do not have immortal souls. When they violently die, they just turn into ocean foam and completely cease to exist forever in the void. Her desperate quest for actual human legs was not just a silly teenage crush. It was a panicked, terrifying attempt to avoid absolute cosmic annihilation. Andersen violently injected this super heavy theological terror right under the shiny surface of a simple fairy tale. Disney made the absolute smartest choice in total movie history by completely cutting the whole non-existence angle entirely. Explaining the terrifying endless void of eternal nothingness to kids is rough. 20. The Lion King is basically just a highly sanitized, incredibly watered-down animated version of the hardcore actual history of the Mali Empire. The massive historical epic of Sundiata Keita tells of a highly real prince who was severely mocked for physical weakness, survived vicious family betrayals, entirely endured total exile, and then violently returned to totally crush a terrifying usurper. They literally called him the Lion of Mali, massive centuries before anyone happily drew a singing cartoon warthog. The ancient epic has the exact same plot: the threatened royal line, the banished young heir, and the triumphant bloody return. The only real difference is the actual historical story massively involves totally brutal medieval warfare, highly vicious political assassinations, and total completely ruthless nation building. Real-life Hakuna Matata absolutely involved a massive amount of actual organized stabbing. 21. The Wizard of Oz gets incredibly uncomfortable when you closely look at the highly famous flying monkeys through the extremely harsh lens of early American politics. The famous author L. Frank Baum actually wrote violently racist newspaper editorials loudly calling for the absolute destruction of Native Americans. In the original book, the creepy winged monkeys are a native group violently forced into totally miserable servitude by absolutely whoever holds the magical golden cap. While it is not a perfectly clean secret code, reading the entire story while knowing Baum's real-life political hatred makes the whole thing feel super gross. Bright and perfectly shiny Oz is heavily built right on top of a dark history of massive colonial conquest. Taking totally real historical suffering, absolute total displacement, and violently turning it into a fun fantasy obstacle course completely ruins the yellow brick road. 22. Rapunzel violently feels deeply disturbing when you carefully trace its highly mythological roots all the way back to the incredibly brutal legend of Saint Barbara. Her fiercely controlling, completely paranoid pagan father entirely locked her at the very top of a massive stone tower just to isolate her from the highly dangerous outside world. When she absolutely refused to blindly follow his extremely strict rules and changed her personal religion, he completely snapped and violently beheaded her himself. While Rapunzel did not exactly copy this horrific story word for word, the terrifying psychological overlap is impossible to unsee. It is completely about insane paternal control, a giant stone prison, and heavily treating female independence like a massive, unforgivable crime. Fighting a giant fire-breathing dragon is scary, but a toxic parent who honestly thinks love means absolute physical ownership is terrifying. 23. Little Red Riding Hood is absolutely not a cute little moral fable about basic stranger danger. It is incredibly closely tied to a horrifying, totally real-life bloodbath. In 18th century France, a massive unknown predator, famously known as the Beast of Gévaudan, violently slaughtered well over 100 entirely innocent people in savage, totally unprovoked attacks. It specifically targeted young women and innocent children, totally sending the entire rural region into absolute hysterical panic. The wealthy French king literally had to send the highly armed military army just to hunt this weird wolf-like freak of nature completely down. When an entire society heavily lives in totally justified terror of a massive monster physically ripping people apart in the local forest, a cute story about a little girl meeting a talking wolf is totally not a fun fantasy. It is a public safety announcement. 24. Bluebeard is absolutely terrifying because it heavily echoes the deeply messed up, completely horrific life of Gilles de Rais. He was a ridiculously wealthy French nobleman, a famous former military buddy of Joan of Arc, who aggressively used his massive wealth and completely untouchable aristocratic status to cover up his real horrific hobby, which was brutally murdering dozens of innocent children. The truly creepy part of Bluebeard is absolutely not the glowing magic key or the highly bloody secret room of absolute doom. It is the chilling, extremely real reality that immense royal wealth and highly polite manners can incredibly easily hide a complete, total psychopath. History is packed with well-dressed monsters who were highly praised as totally upstanding pillars of the community right up until someone violently checked the cellar door. A villain with massive political immunity is the ultimate nightmare. 25. The Bremen Town Musicians totally aggressively pretends to be a wacky fun animal comedy, but it actually perfectly exposes the completely heartless, extremely brutal economics of totally old rural farm life. The poor donkey, totally loyal dog, tired cat, and exhausted rooster are completely worn out. So their practical, totally ruthless owners secretly decide the absolute most logical next step is total immediate execution. It is a brutal, totally crushing reminder that in historical farming communities, your absolute right to simply stay alive was strictly tied to exactly how much intense manual labor you could physically produce. The exact second your physical joints went bad, highly basic human mercy completely vanished. The famous story is essentially just a massive, desperate labor union strongly formed by highly depressed senior citizens who were just aggressively told to completely go die quietly off-screen. 26. Robin Hood is absolutely definitely not just a highly fun, harmless story about a charming guy who strongly loves basic archery and aggressively wearing green tights. It is a totally massive direct violent reaction to the unbelievably cruel medieval forest laws of England. Powerful, arrogant kings violently claimed huge tracts of massive land and intensely made it a massive absolute crime for starving peasants to simply hunt even a single totally tiny rabbit. If you got caught secretly poaching the wealthy king's deer, you could absolutely literally be permanently blinded or fully castrated by highly aggressive, completely ruthless royal guards. When the corrupt legal system openly heavily decides that entirely arrogant aristocratic hunting trips are vastly more important than actual humans completely surviving winter, you absolutely totally get a massive peasant rebellion. 27. King Arthur is wildly famous for highly shiny, incredibly magical armor and completely noble romantic quests. But the actual real history heavily behind the highly famous massive myth was a totally miserable, incredibly muddy, absolute apocalypse. If highly famous Arthur truly existed at all, he was absolutely a gritty, completely desperate, violent warlord in post-Roman Britain. This was a completely brutal, entirely violent time when absolute society was completely collapsing into highly, absolute, violent, total chaos. There were absolutely no highly glittering, massive castles, fancy magic absolute swords, or highly polite, totally shiny knights warmly quoting romantic poetry. Camelot was highly likely simply just a dirty, heavily fortified complete mud hill, highly violently run by a totally dirty guy with a slightly better total horse. The round table was added later, just to sell romance. 28. Bambi violently shatters your entire heart into a totally massive million pieces when you strongly realize the original 1923 absolutely famous novel was entirely not about completely cute, innocent deer. It was a completely brilliant, entirely deeply terrifying absolute allegory for entirely massive Jewish persecution in completely absolute Europe. Written totally heavily by absolutely famous Austrian Jewish author Felix Salten, the incredibly dark, completely massive book totally depicts a deep, dark forest where entirely innocent, completely pure animals live in totally constant, paralyzing, absolute fear of entirely highly random, completely brutal, absolute execution by a totally unseen, massive, highly violent force. The absolute, completely vicious Nazis clearly totally understood this exact, highly powerful, entirely massive, completely perfectly crafted metaphor, which is why they aggressively burned the book. 29. Humpty Dumpty was almost certainly never a clumsy, completely fragile, entirely cute egg, which actually completely makes the entire famous rhyme infinitely more hilarious and absolutely completely absurd. According to a highly wild, completely historical theory, Humpty Dumpty was actually the totally official absolute nickname of a completely gigantic, incredibly heavy, totally massive cannon entirely used heavily during the English Civil War in 1648. The highly desperate defenders put it on a high, massive total wall. The entirely completely blasted wall fell, and the gun fell totally directly into absolutely massive complete mud. The king's men simply could not lift it because heavy weapons are heavy. Changing a highly humiliating military logistics failure into a weird story about a fragile breakfast item is top-tier historical trolling. 30. The Three Billy Goats. Gruff completely captures the absolute worst, highly annoying part of historical medieval travel. The completely extreme, totally absolute local total warlord who entirely turns absolute basic geography completely into a totally massive aggressive extortion racket. The ugly, entirely green, totally absolute troll is simply just a totally accurate, completely terrifying, entirely mythological stand-in for an incredibly greedy aristocrat. In medieval Europe, passing narrow bridges meant dealing with totally armed thugs who demanded massive tolls just to let you cross alive. If you refused to pay the ridiculous fee, the aggressive strongman simply murdered you on the spot. The story resonates perfectly because humans have always deeply hated paying ridiculous hidden fees just to travel anywhere. The unrealistic part is, he did not invent surge pricing. 31. The Three Little Pigs sounds exactly like an entirely fun, totally complete basic lecture on construction materials. But it strongly echoes the highly completely brutal nightmare of the Scottish Highland clearances. totally, absolute wealthy, completely highly heartless entirely. Massive landlords, totally violently forced poor tenant farmers entirely completely off their highly total absolute land. They literally destroyed fragile homes just to make way for highly profitable sheep pastures. The totally famous big bad entirely absolute wolf is basically highly, completely just entirely extremely aggressive real estate, absolute development, highly absolutely wearing terrifying animal fur. The extremely smart pig with the brick house is simply the only totally brilliant guy who somehow managed to hire a totally brilliant lawyer before the massive aggressive landlord violently arrived. 32. Goldilocks was completely violently scrubbed incredibly clean by totally modern media, entirely because the absolutely original version was incredibly hostile, totally weird, and deeply, entirely unsettling. The totally very absolutely first intruder was entirely, absolutely not a highly completely cute, entirely confused, absolute blonde toddler, completely making a totally harmless absolute mistake. She was a highly completely absolutely entirely old, highly absolute vagrant. She was an incredibly rude, terrifying old outsider who aggressively broke into a totally private home, completely stole massive amounts of food, and violently acted like basic human boundaries were a highly personal insult. This completely totally reflects intense 19th century middle-class paranoia about poor desperate outsiders invading their totally perfect, absolutely safe suburban lives. The story is literally just a massive home security pamphlet aggressively wrapped up in a cozy bedtime story. So, reality is vastly more terrifying than fiction, and your childhood heroes were mostly victims of horrific medieval economics. I know I missed some absolute madness. Which completely unhinged, horrifying fairy tale origin did I completely fail to mention? Drop your highly aggressive corrections in the comments right now and let us argue. If you enjoyed having your innocent memories violently shattered today, hit that like button, forcefully subscribe, and share this historical trauma.